What if Ukraine could destroy facilities that make gasoline, and somehow cause gasoline prices to drop as a result, at least in the West? It sounds like an American magical Christmas land, where Western consumers get to keep more money in their pockets and less money funnels into the Russian war machine. Well, today, I am here to tell you that this is theoretically possible, but that the assumptions required to get there are going to be hard to come by. Okay, some basics. There are 3 steps in the gas consumption process. First, crude oil gets pumped out of the ground. There is not much you can do with the raw liquid, though, so the next step is to send barrels of the black gold to refineries. There, the crude oil undergoes a series of treatments to produce a variety of output products, including gasoline. That is what end consumers put into their vehicles, thereby completing this chain. Now, the reason that the opening premise sounded like magical Christmas land is due to the basic laws of supply and demand. Under perfect market conditions, crude goes to refineries, and gasoline goes to consumers in an efficient equilibrium. But if one of those refineries stops producing gasoline, then it is going to stop accepting crude. It would be convenient if that crude could just be rerouted to another refinery, which could then supply the existing gasoline consumers. But, as we will discuss later, extra refinery capacity like this does not really exist. Thus, if one of the refineries were to be destroyed, this crude has nowhere to go, and thus this gasoline never gets produced. What happens next is a main point of concern within Washington right now. The core problem is that you have less fuel going to the same number of consumers. The consumers therefore compete with each other on price, causing that price to increase until one of them decides not to buy. Based on the most scientific poll ever conducted, it appears that viewers of this channel by and large believe this to be the prevailing consequence on American gas prices, if refineries get destroyed. Even a good portion of the neutral choice voters seem to think that the price will go up, but not by enough to be noticeable. Still, the 5% of dissenters are vocal, especially in the comments section from my last video about the refinery campaign, so it is worth taking a deeper dive into what exactly is going on here. With that, how might we be able to break from the standard supply and demand economics? Well, we do not quite have a globalized oil market anymore, fully responsive to those forces. Ever since the invasion of Ukraine, we have had a Russian market and a global market, with various ways to cross over that we will return to later. I am not drawing this to scale, but Russia has disproportionately more crude production compared to the rest of the world, and disproportionately less refining capacity, and further disproportionately fewer consumers. For clarity, as we go through the many possible situations, I will track what happens to the prices of both crude oil and gasoline. These often just get lumped together as oil prices, a crime that, truth be told, I am often guilty of. Now, that shorthanding is fine under most circumstances, because those prices usually increase or decrease together. But that label is imprecise, and we are going to see how their prices can break apart in a moment. The important thing to remember, though, is that the Biden administration primarily cares about gas prices, not what refineries are paying for crude. That is because gasoline prices are the things that Western voters actually pay, and it is the point of public concern in the White House regarding inflation and keeping the European coalition together. Privately, high gas prices are also what the Biden administration fears come November, namely that voters will turn against the president because of them. Oh, and also for this exercise, I'm going to make life simple for us by leaving out transaction costs, vertical monopolies, and any sort of collusion between firms. Rather, we will just look at a purely competitive market. Okay, let's imagine a world where sanctions have created a gasoline barrier between Russia and the outside world. Thus, whatever gasoline is produced in Russia stays in Russia, and whatever gasoline is produced outside of Russia stays outside of Russia. Then Ukraine destroys a Russian refinery. What happens next? Well, an obvious problem arises for Russian crude producers. Although only gasoline is restricted for the moment, that is still a concern for specifically this crude producer, because it used to send its barrels of oil there. The upshot here is that it can easily send its crude abroad instead. We will assume for the time being that the non-Russian refineries have the capacity to take on that extra crude. This leads to a saturation of both crude and then later gasoline on the right of the divide. As a result, prices of both decline. In turn, the West shoots the moon in this scenario. Russia loses income from the destroyed refineries, but somehow the West does not end up worse off. Instead, it forces the fuel into Western markets, which ends up making American consumers better off. Americans can have their cake and eat it too. However, this outcome breaks down if any of the three assumptions is violated. First, if there is no slack in the non-Russian refineries, then the influx of crude does nothing for the final gasoline price. That is because these refineries were already producing as much gas as was mechanically possible beforehand. Instead, the refineries get rich. All of the extra crude on the market lowers the input price, which allows them to pocket the extra money, not the consumers. Now, is there spare utilization available? That is hard to know. The U.S. Energy Information Administration tracks domestic utilization data, and right now we are about at the historical average. Specifically, utilization in May 2024 ranged from 88.1% to 89.5%. That may sound like there is a spare 10% to work with, but unfortunately, that is not how refineries operate. Utilization is never at 100%, because the facilities also need to undergo routine maintenance. It also does not help that they tend to be built on the coast to increase import efficiency, but that coastlines disproportionately suffer natural disasters. Zooming out, refineries are extremely capital intensive, so operators need to run them as much as possible for them to be profitable. That is to say, redundant refineries are not just sitting around. Indeed, the only time that utilization falls off is when something really bad is happening in the world, which then drives down demand for gasoline. To the contrary, the underlying concern in the energy industry is a shortage of refineries, largely because they are just not being built anymore. Why not? Well, a big part is due to the expectation that green energy might make them unprofitable in a decade or two. And remember, capital-intensive industries need a long time horizon for the business model to work out. In summary, it may be possible for the other refineries to pick up some of the slack, but it is questionable whether they can take up all of it. Nevertheless, so far this is not a bad outcome from a political perspective for the West. To whatever extent there is some open utilization, gasoline prices go down outside of Russia. The situation becomes more concerning when we look at the two remaining assumptions, though. Next, suppose that Russia is not isolated from the gasoline markets. Visually, we need to tear down this wall. Now the problem is that the gasoline market is fully competitive, and so consumers in and out of Russia are competing for the same fuel. But the destruction of a refinery still means that less fuel is being produced overall. Thus, gasoline prices go up across the board. This point is often misunderstood. You may have heard the false belief that somehow once gasoline is produced in one place, that it will stay there. But that is just not how it works. Gasoline is a global commodity. For example, in 2023, 900,000 barrels of gasoline per day were produced in the United States and sent elsewhere. The reason is that refineries just want to make as much money as possible. And if another country is willing to buy at a higher price, the refiners are happy to ship there. Thus, with Russian refineries no longer meeting Russian demand, Russian demand starts seeking external supply. Prices rise everywhere because there is less gasoline to go around. And indeed, we are seeing the signs of this, with Russia beginning to import gasoline from Belarus and Kazakhstan. Now, there is an important caveat worth noting here. At the moment, it is unclear whether Western sanctions have enough impact here to limit imports. Put differently, there may still be a wall, but the question is how porous it is. If it is slightly leaky, then US consumers could still benefit. If there are more gaps, then that is more problematic. I know I promised not to talk about transaction costs today, but this is a place where they matter quite a bit. When you see headlines like these, the question you need to ask yourself is how much the sanctions regime is adding to the purchase price, which in turn suppresses Russian demand. Sanctions are not an impenetrable wall. The stuff you want will get through, whether we are talking about gasoline or microchips. The true test of the regime is just how much will sneak by, and that is why the distinction between these two matters. Finally, relaxing the free transit of Russian crude causes more problems. For background here, the West set a $60 price cap on Russian crude oil exports back in December 2022. This was largely enforced by the West's control over international shipping insurance, which, as we all know now, is absolutely key to have. Rather than agree to the limited sanction, the Kremlin instead tried to build a shadow fleet of tankers that would operate outside of the scheme. There is not an infinite supply of tankers in the world, however, and the accumulation of inefficient trips sailing from St. Petersburg all the way over to Asia instead of Europe has pushed the tanker market to its limit. Oh, and then the Houthis made things even more interesting by causing ships to avoid the Red Sea entirely. The point is that the crude does not seem to be free-flowing out of Russia. The Kremlin is always looking for a way to export more, of course, but there is no magic wand that will take the crude that was originally supposed to go here and get it to here instead. You wind up having to shutter a well. In fact, we have discussed before how this is a deliberate part of the scheme. Thus, we end up with further cuts to the gasoline supply and higher consumer prices all around. Interestingly, this can also lead to higher crude prices outside of Russia. Even though the same number of crude wells are serving the same number of refineries, remember that the final gasoline price is higher due to the lower supply. This gives more bargaining power to the fortunate few who can serve crude outside of Russia, which in turn raises the price that they can fetch from the refineries. Meanwhile, also note that higher gasoline prices persist here, even if there is infinite refinery capacity outside of Russia. You see, the extra slack means nothing if no oil can get there. Now, you might be curious what has actually happened to prices over the last 5 months. I hesitate to talk about this because a million other things are happening with the market, so you cannot just look at a single time series and make any causal claims about oil prices in 2024. But that warning aside, crude oil prices are somewhere between stagnant and trending up. Some part of the bump at the end of March is attributable to OPEC's announced cuts, but we have discussed before how that ties together with Russia's problems due to the war, so it is unclear whether we should count that separately. Meanwhile, gasoline in the United States has risen from $3.21 at the start of the year to $3.70 at the end of May. But again, I would advise not reading too much into that. In any case, the takeaway point here is that while it is theoretically possible for Ukraine's refinery attacks to lower both crude oil and gasoline prices in the West, we have seen that the assumptions to get there are quite onerous. Of course, that does not tell us whether it is a good political decision for Washington to support Ukraine continuing the strikes. An answer there requires a value judgment of how much someone is willing to pay to coerce Russia, an expectation on whether it will cause the European Union to start to get cold feet, and an intelligence assessment of just how much pain it is inflicting on the Kremlin. Rather, we are seeing that there is no such thing as a free lunch for the West here. But do you know what is free? Watching this channel. On the other hand, do you know what else is not free? My books on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Seriously, I do not have a Patreon or anything like that, so if you want to support the channel, that's a great way to do it. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.